Hi, everyone. It's Danielle, and I am here to talk about Module 6. In particular, I'll be focusing on the research essay. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we don't want to see my Zoom login. So I'm going to pull up our Canvas course, which I have open. Okay. And I just wanted to give a brief reminder of the work that we did last week for Module 5, which is titled Using Logic to Develop an Argument. So it's a really important connection to understand when writing research papers, particularly argumentative research papers, which is the type of research paper that you're doing for this class. So you had the assignment on identifying logical fallacies, and as a reminder, we do that so we want students to be able to recognize when there is a problem or a flaw in the logic that someone is making, and being able to identify those in theory will helps us be more aware of those when we're making our own arguments, so that as we put forth a thesis statement or an argument, and we go on in the body paragraphs to develop that argument, that we aren't relying on or aren't slipping into the territory of fallacious logic, or logic that it doesn't, there's problems with it. Because when we start seeing problems with logic and argument, you're going to start losing your reader, because your reader is going to question your credibility and your ability to make a solid argument that makes sense. If they can easily poke holes in your argument or say, well, that's quote unquote a slippery slope, then that's a problem. That's, as writers, we have to, I always call it, or kind of use it's a little bit of maybe an aggressive metaphor, but I always say we want to we want our arguments to be bulletproof. Because my job, when I look at student essays and most writing in general, my job is to try to see where the weaknesses are in the argument. So where is the writing falling apart because it's not using logic that makes sense, or it's not using evidence in a way that helps it to be solid? And where am I able to kind of cut this argument off at the knees really quickly? And I can do this in a matter of seconds, because I've done it for so long and I'm trained in it. But that's my job, is when I read, I'm reading to see how you're writing and see how your writing is developing. But I'm also, part of the feedback that I intend to, or I seek to give to students, is based on these are the weaknesses I'm finding in your art and your ability to engage in argumentation. Let's, here's something to continue working on as you keep writing. And then the organizing your thoughts assignment, which was about organizing your thoughts, asked you to craft, some form of outline to put together what you think might serve as an organizational structure for the research paper. So moving on to Module 6 this week. The week is titled Integrating Sources to Support Your Purpose. So this is such an important topic. I can't emphasize it enough. I just know that in every class I teach, I think almost in every single piece of feedback I give, despite the class, despite the assignment, I always have something to say about evidence integration. evidence integration is a higher order concern. So we have higher order concerns and lower order concerns. And it's a higher order concern. And those are like the major parts of a writing project. So we're talking those rhetorical moves, for example, are higher order concerns. A thesis statement or an argument that makes sense is a higher order concern. Organization and structure is a higher order concern, excuse me. The type of research that we integrate and how we go about integrating the research, those are higher order concerns. Lower order concerns are things like sentence at the sentence level, the syntax, how words are ordered, punctuation, spelling, these kind of things that should get addressed in the editing part of the writing process, which is the very, very last part of the writing process. Everything else should be done before we get to editing. I actually love editing. It's a lot of fun because all of the hard work has been done. And now it's a matter of, let me go through and make sure that my punctuation is correct, my spelling's correct, my grammar is as good as it can be. It's not going to be perfect because that grammar also includes things like editing for concision or avoiding wordiness. And I've been a wordy writer my whole life, and it's something that I'm constantly having to it's not about improving my wordiness, it's about being aware of it and then editing it and revising my writing so that it is more concise. So integrating sources is there's sometimes it's like I don't even know where to start when I talk about integrating sources. So I'm going to try to keep it simple because I've made a lot of videos on integrating research because students really struggle with it. It's very common for students to struggle with it. It's not something that annoys me that students struggle with it because evidence integration, because it's a higher order concern, it's a little bit more difficult to practice, to engage in. So it's more about, it's just something that I'm aware that, not everybody is it's not going to click for everybody super, the same and fast all the time. And evidence integration is also something that we learn across multiple classes and multiple years. It's not something that you necessarily will have mastered in this class. That's not at all an expectation. So it's more of being aware of it and being aware of some of the best practices. And, to this day, even in my writing, I still am looking at how I integrate evidence and thinking, what's the best way to integrate this evidence? And we use the word integrate very purposefully. And I'll get to that when I'll talk about, the word integration, and the intent behind why we call it integrating research or integrating evidence rather than just, using sources. That means something different. So for module 6, you have these reading and resources that are available for you. This is from, we've had something else from Kyle Studman. It's Kyle Studman again. I went to grad school with him, so he's a lovely person, lovely professor. And so I really respect his work. And so he has this article here on annoying ways people use versus I'm loving his title. It's very Kyle Studman title, but this is going to be a good article to get some good takeaways about evidence integration, or how people use sources. So I always, anytime there's something from Carl Sedman, I always think it's fantastic. And then there, of course, is reference to, hey, the APA, because obviously with integrating sources, APA is going to be, since that's the style guide we're using, APA is going to be very relevant, just as it was relevant in the annotated bibliography assignment. It's continuing to be relevant. So you have the discussion this week, which is on paraphrasing and summarizing. So, and as a discussion assignment, remember discussions are post and responses. So it's a combination. It's meant to be kind of a dialogue. So in this assignment, you are asked to engage with paraphrasing. I'm struggling to speak a little because I have a lot of thoughts on this, as I usually always have a lot of thoughts on everything. But the three main ways we integrate sources in writing are direct quotation, paraphrasing, and summary. And so those are the 3 ways. This is emphasizing paraphrasing and summary because that's what APA prefers. If you were working in MLA, you would steer away from paraphrasing and summary and work more on direct quotation. That has to do with the types of sources that are used, usually in courses like the humanities, which this is a humanities course, and a social science or something else. But paraphrasing is in most universities, a first year composition class like English 123 would be teaching MLA. And that's because MLA is, in most people's estimation, an easier style guide to use. And direct quotation, the cognitive work and the writing that are required for direct quotation are easier to do than paraphrasing or summary. I don't know that I ever do summary. I do paraphrase, even in MLA, but I don't, most of my writing, I use what's called Chicago Arabian. So I usually don't even, occasionally I'll write in MLA, but even then I will sometimes paraphrase, but I'm still doing a lot of direct quotation. And paraphrasing actually takes more cognitive work and it's more difficult to do, which is why most English like 1, 2, 3 courses like this, first year composition courses, tend to focus on MLA. Let's start with direct quotation and integrating that. And then you can move on to the more difficult type of integration, which is paraphrasing. The reason that paraphrasing is more difficult is because you're writing something in your own words. So it says here, right? Effective paraphrasing and citation skills allows writers to clearly and concisely present and credit the most important or relevant ideas from published works in their papers. That doesn't necessarily say what paraphrasing is, but there's some misconception in terms of paraphrasing and what it is. So I often tell people one of the best ways to practice paraphrasing, because this activity is asking you to practice paraphrasing and citation skills. One of the best ways to practice, and actually let's just look at this document. Maybe I should just download it. It might be faster. Okay. So it's, right, we've got activity 1, activity 2, and activity 3. And then there are some, it's like an answer key. So the way I tell people to best practice paraphrasing, is when you read something from a source that you're using, something that you want to, an idea or something that you want to integrate into your writing, is to read it, put it aside. I'm doing this like it's on paper because I usually always work with paper things. If it's on your screen, get it off your screen so you're not looking at it. And then from your memory, rewrite that idea in your own words by not looking at all at the source. Because where students can flub up in paraphrasing very easily is they will almost quote it directly, but change a few words here or there and presume that that's paraphrasing, but that's actually not paraphrasing at all. That becomes unintentional plagiarism, because when only a couple words are, not even a couple, even several words are changed, it's still too close enough to the actual wording from the source that it doesn't merit paraphrasing. It's a lenient version of direct quotation. And then we're now in the territory of unintentional plagiarism. And a lot of times if I see that, I'll just say, just quote it directly. So when you actually practice paraphrasing, I'll just repeat it one more time. It's, this is an idea I want to put into my paper. Don't look at it anymore. Put it aside, out of view. It should only be in your head. And then write a paraphrase of that, of whatever is from the source that you want to paraphrase. And that is considered like the best practice for engaging in paraphrase, and not like hands down. So for this particular activity, right, it's asking you to, read the following published sentence and then paraphrase it. That is, rewrite it in your own words. You do not need to repeat every element. You shouldn't. Sometimes there are things you have to repeat. So, for example, if something has numbers in it, statistics, percentages, a dollar sign or dollar amounts, anything like that, like you can't make that up. You can't rewrite that. So there's sometimes things that are part of paraphrasing that it still has to go in the paraphrase. Maybe they wrote 50%. You can't be like, oh, it was half, just say 50%. It's not that every single word needs to be different, but it should be written in your own writing and should be pretty different from or different enough from the actual source material. But like this says, you don't need to, and oftentimes there are a lot of times where you have to include some things from the source material because there's no other way to say it. And here, right, try changing the focus of the sentence while preserving the meaning of the original. And that's the key to not only paraphrasing, but also revision a lot of times. And then it's saying, write the APA reference list, and then figure out the in-text citation corresponding to the reference list entry, and then add a parenthetical citation. So, and that's just what this means here, is that it's not explicitly saying it, but I know what the subtext is here. And that's because there's a direct connection between in-text citations and the references page. So there's a reason for everything. So there's a reason that things are cited a certain way in text, or the citations or those parentheticals, and those correspond to how something is cited on the reference page. And so this is asking you to be aware of, this is how it would be cited on a reference page, and then this is how I would cite it as an in-text citation, and they should match. because there's a lot of times where it's like, you have it cited as this in the in-text citation, but when I go to look at it on the references page, I can't find it, or I'm struggling to find it because it's cited differently. So that's something normal. And there's some examples on here. I'm not going to go over this too much because the next activity is on summarizing. So this will focus on kind of like the very kind of nuanced minor differences between summarizing and paraphrasing. There is a difference. Direct quotation, paraphrasing, and summarizing is kind of like I don't know what to call that math term of that like triangle that goes out, but it's like direct quotation is like, this is exactly what the text says. Paraphrasing is like, this is what something says in my own words, and it's keeping, it's relatively close. Summary is like a much more broader, integration of a source that is not necessarily as specific as paraphrasing, and definitely not as specific as direct quotation. So it's kind of like going as close from the exact source itself, from direct quotation outward to summarizing, which is a much broader integration type. I honestly wouldn't even mess around with summarizing it, because it even at my stage, I'm like, am I paraphrasing or summarizing? It can be confusing. But anyways, that's this assignment. And it gets, writing a long paraphrase, which I'm not going to get into that because I don't want this video to be 5 hours long. It won't be that long. Okay. Now, if we move on, I forgot that I opened that up. Let me go to next. Okay. And then this is the rough draft, and then there'll be peer review, which is all this week. So the overview of the rough draft of your research essay is, and I provided the feedback I provided on the annotated bibliography was predominantly about the types of sources you were using, and also the citational work, so how they were cited. So you'll be writing a rough draft, should be at least 1,000 words. Remember, this doesn't include those paratextual elements like the title, reference page, the cover page, etc. Gives you some brief criteria here about the introduction, the body paragraphs, and a conclusion. It's reminding you about the APA student paper guidelines, which you can look at in your APA manual or on that OWL at Purdue site. And then you have some submission instructions. However, what I want to focus on is, and what you want to look at also and be aware of as you're writing your rough draft, is the final draft rubric. Because you want to be writing now in consideration of the actual rubric. So if you go to the next module and you look at the final draft and reflection, we're not going to talk about the reflection because that's separate. In terms of like, we're just focusing on the research, or I'm just focusing on the research essay right now. This talks more specifically about what to do in the reflection. But what you have here is you have the rubric for the research essay. The final rubric area is for the reflection. But this will provide hopefully some additional guidance about what do I do, or what is, what should I aim for generally. A lot of these are very general, but it gives you some guidance as well. So what should I do in the introduction? What should I do in the body? What should I do in the conclusion? How sources are used. And this is also where it says you have to have 5 high quality sources to support the paper's ideas. All sources are well integrated and quotes, if used, are properly introduced. That's called signposting. Paraphrasing is used whenever possible. All sources are cited properly in APA style. Do you need in-text citations for paraphrasing and direct quoting? Yes, you need it. You need in-text citations, parentheticals for direct quotation, paraphrase, and summary. And at every single point in your paper where you do that work. There's a rubric area for the references list, right? This is going to be, how are you citing your sources? Are you citing them correctly? Making sure that all the sources that you have in your paper are cited on the reference page, that sort of thing. Conventions focuses on those lower order concerns, right? A command of grammar and mechanics conventions, excuse me, and shows evidence of careful proofreading, that you have polish in the editing part of the writing process. And it uses APA style conventions. Please note that there is a difference between the citational work and APA formatting, like of the whole paper, as well as I'm not going to say that because I don't think that's necessarily relevant. This is focusing on the formatting, right? It even says title page, spacing, margins, font, right? So it's there are two separate spaces for that. For one, recognizing citational practices of APA, and then one focusing more on format in addition to overall sentence mechanics and those lower order concerns. Whenever I make videos on APA, I always have one on format and one on citational practices. I always divvy it up because they are different things. Okay, so this is the rubric. So what I'm going to do right now is you can see I have a lot of things open right now. Okay. I have a student sample paper that is something I'm going to use, and I pulled my notes from it, and I wanted to use this one because it got a straight 75, and I thought a 75 score would be a good example to use, because a C is an average grade. A C means you did, if we go back to the rubric, a C means you did all of these things. You did them. You completed them. You get the C. When we talk about B's and A's, and I think I talk about this in my policies, B's and A's are when we take these writing conventions and writing ideas and we either execute it better, we're now exceeding just the basic bare minimum of what do I have to do to complete the assignment, versus I'm doing that, but I'm also now doing these things. And then an A is, a step up from that. So that's why I thought a 75 would be a good, because I could pull an A, or a D or an F, right? I could pull those. I think a B would not be very useful. But so I chose the 75 paper because I thought, right, it's right in the middle. It's doing the bare minimum. Let's see where they could have done better. And I also noted that the Turnitin score they had was 30%. I'm not going to talk much about Turnitin right now. 30% is an acceptable score. I like to talk about Turnitin as a tool to use to understand how you are using sources in your work. When I see any Turnitin score at 30% or higher, I do open up what's called the originality report, which is provided by Turnitin. And I look at it just to make sure, hey, what's being flagged here by Turnitin. Usually something within the 30s is not that big of a deal. It's not that long of a paper. So when we start getting into the 40% or the 50%, 60%, 40s and 50s, maybe 60s, but not all the time, not necessarily, tell me that usually the student is engaging in unintentional plagiarism, or they have gone into the realm of what's called source dependency. And source dependency is where the writer's voice, the student's voice, is not the dominant voice in the paper. And so that's its own issue. So because when we bring in other voices into our paper and integrate them with our own voice as writers, we always have to make sure that our voice is the loudest, our voice is the most dominant. And if anybody struggles with source dependency, I always tell people, wait, just if you're worried about it, one of a good practice, and I've done it myself because I also need, this gets into a lot of evidence integration conversation, but even me, when I'm integrating evidence, I'm like, am I doing what's called evidence analysis? Am I doing enough evidence analysis? That means I'm putting in a quotation and I'm now explaining why it's there, the work that it's doing, how is it serving the purpose of my thesis, how, I'm analyzing the evidence itself and then connecting it to the overall thesis and argument. That's not work that the reader ever should be doing. That's always the work of the writer. When we just throw in quotations or paraphrases and we're like, there you go, have fun making out with that what you will, and you're not telling the reader, this is why I've included this. This is what it's doing. This is what it means. This is, in my interpretation, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. Then you're doing not great practices with evidence integration. And that can sometimes lead to source dependency is the student is depending on the sources to do the talking. And their voice has become very minimal. And so a way to circumnavigate that is to highlight. And you highlight everywhere that's your voice in the paper. And then you highlight your other voices, your sources' voices, quotations or paraphrases or summaries. And then you visualize it. Okay, it's pink for my voice, green for other sources' voices. How much pink is there and how much green is there? Is there significantly more pink than there is green? Because that's what we want. If there's more green than pink, or the green and pink are equal, now we're into source dependency, and your voice is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and the reader is going to be more and more confused because you aren't making those connections between the evidence that's being integrated, the green stuff, and what you have to ultimately say about it. So you're essentially saying, hey, reader, you do the work. Now, that type of writing is done in other cultures. So I want to make it clear that I'm not denigrating that type of practice. In what's called American Academic English, AAE, we don't practice that. So, and I'm TEFL TESOL certified, so meaning I'm trained to work with international students. And so I've learned a lot about different cultural practices when it comes to writing, particularly with evidence integration. And sometimes it's very different, the way that American academic English asks students to, it's your voice that's dominant. It's your voice that is doing the majority of talking, and you're only using these sources to build that bulletproof case where I can't come in and say, here's all these weaknesses. So sometimes that can be a very different way of writing for a lot of students. Anyways, I am going to beep that. So, okay, I've talked a lot. I'm going to go on. I'm going to kind of look at this now. And the first thing when I get a draft, this is not a draft, this is a final submission. The first thing I'm going to look at, obviously, is the cover page. Is the cover page doing APA formatting correctly? The student is not doing it correctly. They're doing some things correctly and some things not correctly. They have the page number up here, which is correct, and that's what we want. But make this a little bit bigger. I talked a lot about sentence case and title case in class. You can see that every single word here is capitalized, and that's not correct. We have a coordinating conjunction, we have an article, and then we have a preposition, and then we have another article, right? So the title case is not being used correctly there. Also, this is not double spaced. They're also missing this part that everybody seems to miss. Not necessarily you guys, but in my history of teaching with the new APA 7. Did I spell something wrong? No, it just isn't like that, right? And then they're also missing that. And so they're missing some things on the cover page. They're doing the date correctly, which is nice, because I'm going to spell out that full month. And then there's only that one comma there. It's weird how many times people confuse dates. It's because it's also it's different in MLA. I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to change the entire spacing. I go through this in my APA video, but I'm going to do it here because I want to make sure that the spacing is uniform, because that's part of the right spacing. Spacing is part of APA format. It's a requirement. And what spacing means is uniform double spacing. So when you open up the paragraph dialog box, which I get to by here, it looks the same. I'm on a Mac, it looks the same on a PC. I'm gonna go to line spacing options. Now I've pressed Command A. That means that the entire paper is selected. You have to make sure you have uniform spacing throughout the entire paper. This is how you would do it now, because I also want to note that they have this single space, they have this double space. We've got these extra spaces between paragraphs, which I'm not sure why they're there, because indentations are doing the work of this is a new paragraph. We don't need space and indentation. That's what we would call grammatically tautological. It's redundant. It's not needed. And then when we get to the references page, this is not double spaced. So we have a problem here with the spacing. So I'm just going to go ahead. I actually don't want to double space my notes, so I'm going to select everything except for my notes. And this should be 0 and 0, but this should be double. This is where a lot of people forget to change the before and after. I go through that in more detail on the APA formatting video, so I'm not going to go over it here. And then I'm going to turn on the paragraph so I can see the spacing, because we want at least 2 spaces here. There's a section break. I can't stand section breaks. There's a time and a place to use them, and that's in very long writing pieces. This is not long writing, so there's no need to have section breaks here. But generally, you know, that's how that should look. So other APA formatting, because the next thing I'm going to immediately look at, because you can see that I turn this on. Now, I don't always download. I will download papers from Canvas at times when I want to look at things specifically like this. I want to go into the Word doc and see what is the student actually doing in Word. This is a space, right, that we don't need. Now this is uniform spacing. And as you can see, the indentation indicated by that little arrow there, the indenting, the half-inch indentation tells the reader this is a new paragraph. We don't need extra space and indentation. The reader, this is formatting that's signaling things to the reader. What's missing here is the title. So we have to restate the title here. I'm going to actually turn the paragraph off. I'm going to just copy and paste this. I'm going to make sure it's there. And I'm pretty sure this is centered. Yep. And we want to get rid of that extra space there. Okay. And that does get bold-faced. So really quickly, what I said about, I'll look at the reference page later. What I said about the introduction is that the intro lets the reader know the topic and the problem with which you are dealing, but the intro doesn't provide necessary background information, but general or broad information to suggest that suicide in the military is a problem. This needs to be grounded in much more specific information and probably longitudinal data. And I give an example of what longitudinal data is. It's called focus on the word long there. Longitudinal. It's a data or it's a study, a research study that has been going on for a long period of time. It's not like we did this in 6 months. It's like we spent 10 years or 20 years. An example, I say look at statistics within something like the past 50 years. That's longitudinal data. It's looking at data from a much longer perspective, or much longer period of time than in the past year. Suicide rates in the military, it's like that is pointless data to bring up, because we can't talk about the last year unless we know what the data looks like the previous 5 years, the previous 10 years, the previous 30 years. And so that's why longitudinal data is useful. So this particular paper is on mental health concerns and the bleak impact they have on armed services. It is an APA and an MLA rule that the title has to be reflective of the thesis. This is not necessary. This is better than your average title, but it's still an average title because it doesn't tell me what ultimately, it tells me what the paper is going to address, which is mental health concerns on the armed services. All of the armed services, one branch, you know, but it doesn't tell me ultimately what they're arguing. They do say it has a bleak impact, but I would say that that's redundant, because mental health concerns that's all I need. That's all any reader needs. We don't need, like, if there's a mental health concern, obviously there is a bleak impact. Again, that's tautological. It's redundant. It's not necessary. So all this title tells the reader is this paper is about mental health concerns in the armed services. There's no explanation of what the argument is. You know, we talked about argumentative niches and carving spaces, or the CARS model, creating a research space and what the argument is. But it is an APA and MLA convention that the title reflects what the argument is or what the thesis is. And I always try to tell students, think about it from a research perspective. When you're in the databases and you're trying to find sources that you want to use in your paper, it's so much easier when a scholarly article has a title where you know exactly what they're going to be arguing. There's a lot of titles out there that get published and it's like, that's not a good title. Just because it's scholarly doesn't mean it's great, but it just means that it's better than substantive resources. So, but it's so much easier for the researcher to say, I know exactly what this paper is going to be arguing. I know what they're going to be addressing, and I know what their focus is in terms of their argument in this particular area. So, as always, we read like writers and write like readers. What do we like when we research? Do we like broad abstract titles where we then have to like actually read most of the article to understand what the argument is? Or do we want a nice, succinct, clear like title that tells us what the argument is? And then it's like, yep, that'll probably be helpful for me. I can move on to my next source, right? We want to be efficient. So that's just I feel like I went on a little bit of a side rant on titles, but that's just because I don't think people think enough about titles. If we're just looking at the introduction, if we look at the first sentence, while the world as a whole has more advancements, I'm actually just going to read the entire thing. While the world as a whole has more advancements and mental health, I don't know why that's capitalized, recognition and understanding the way it affects everyone, the armed services need to employ more efforts to catch up. Okay. Vague in some ways and specific in some ways. I'll go back to it. The potentially harmful environments, I'm not a big fan of adverbs, but there are times when we want to use them for hedging purposes. If this just said the harmful environments and policies, that would make it a universal truth, which is a logical fallacy. By including the word potentially, or if you can imagine the word arguably there, then we're using what's called hedging appropriately, because we're saying it's not a universal truth. Stay with me. This is not a universal truth. It's not necessarily true for everything and everybody. I'm trying to make an argument, right? That's part of that carving out I would say carving a research space. I like that better. Okay, swales. Sorry. But so potentially, even though it's an adverb, I'm not a big fan of overusing adverbs because people abuse them. But here we need it because it's hedging. The potentially harmful environments and policies in place where need to be addressed. Otherwise, the armed services rising, that needs to be a possessive, rising number of suicides will only keep growing. So at this point in the introduction, I'm like, I don't have any information. All you have told me thus far is that there's been some advancements in mental health recognition and understanding, two very vague words that is not supported in any way or dissected and fleshed out more specifically. That, hey, the world has, more recognition of mental health, but it really hasn't reached the armed services and they still need assistance. And if it's not addressed, the numbers of suicide in the armed services is going to just keep increasing. It's so incredibly vague. I'm not sure that It's like, I understand what it means, but I have so many questions. So, because it's like, are you talking about, I'm presuming and are inferring, and again, as a reader, I should never be presuming or inferring, because now you're not hand-holding me as a reader anymore. I'm now doing cognitive work on my own to understand what you're trying to say here. Not you, but the student, this person. Firstly, I would say the potentially harmful environments and policies, what does that mean? What policies in place need to be addressed? Explicitly tell me here, tell the reader in the introduction what needs to be addressed. What potentially harmful policies are in place that need to be addressed? And if they're not addressed, suicide rates in the armed services is just going to increase. And that's my other issue, is that they're saying the armed services. Are you talking about the United States Armed Services? Are you talking about all of the military branches? Like, we need that would need to be stated. By armed services, by armed services it refers to blah 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 blah. Like, explain it. Doesn't take long. The other thing that's missing here, because the next sentence says the number of suicides over the years has only increased drastically. So they're adverb, leading to a large question period. It should be a colon. But what is not here, but it might be later in the paper, but it needs to be in the introduction, is what does suicide in the armed services, however the student is defining that, look like? I need numbers. I need numbers from, and that goes back to the note that I gave the student. Like, you have very vague, kind of broad strokes of an idea here and a potential argument, but there's so much specificity missing. It's like, I know enough that I can kind of like keep along, but I'm having to do a lot of cognitive work to be like, okay, I kind of get it, but I kind of also need a lot more information. And the other thing I noted in my notes on the introduction was that data is needed in this introduction. Like, tell us about what suicide rates in the military or the armed services, however we want to refer to them, or refer to that, or a specific military branch. What do those numbers actually look like? We also have to take that with a grain of salt, whatever that data is, because people think data are facts. Data are not facts. Data are as biased as anything else, because how that data was procured, there's always some question of like, how was it gotten? What was, how are you getting this information? So even when we use statistics and percentages and that type of things, I will be the first to say I don't believe in facts. Everything can be questioned. That doesn't mean that we can't include that information in here, but we need to do that hedging language, because we have to recognize that. For example, if the DoD was like, the number of suicides in the military is X, I might be like, okay. And that's because that's because I don't feel like the DoD has a lot of ethos. They don't have a lot of credibility. And I might be thinking, well, you're not a very transparent federal agency. So why would you be transparent about this? Because you may not want people to know what the actual suicide rate is. And also, how are you defining suicide rate as a result of someone serving? Is it while they're serving? Do they have to be actively deployed? What if they're a veteran? Are you including those, or are those two different sets of data? So, you know, all of those types of questions are important and need to be fleshed out here concisely in the introduction. Because when we get into numbers like that, when we're talking about things like suicide and mental health concerns, it's like, okay, well, we need to understand exactly what that means. What are we dealing with? Really, what are we dealing with? And then they, you know, the large question the student proffers is, why would anyone want to join any branch of military when death seems to linger so close to them? I would say that they're larger questions. Where's the mental health care for? I don't know what the suicide rates are because you haven't told me. You haven't defined it. You haven't defined armed services. There's no longitudinal data present, so we don't know. You're saying that it's increased, not just increased drastically. This is why we don't use adverbs. It's like, you can just say it's increased. That's enough. Drastically, it's like you're getting into hyperbolic language and you're going to lose ethos as a writer because of that. Where are we getting this data? Because that data is going to be collected from a lot of different places. And I would say that, you know, and then if the paper's on mental health concerns, what is that? How is, like, okay, can make the connection between mental health concerns and suicide. They eventually kind of get to that in the final sentence, which should be the thesis statement, but it's not one. The current day affairs, I would be very hesitant to label this as strictly a current day issue. I'm pretty sure that this type of thing has been happening for centuries. But it says the current day affairs of stress, suicide, and neglect would make everyone want to give up on being in or joining the military. So that's not a thesis statement. It's not an argument. And there's so many places where I can just say this isn't working. It's a C because it's just getting by. If we go back to look at the introduction, the basic criterion, the introduction identifies the professional or disciplinary community. Now, remember, I will, or not remember, but I will remind you here that this used to be called a classical argument paper. The rubric was slightly different, but it's not that different. So the introduction identifies the professional disciplinary community. They did. It's military. The issue facing that community, they did. It's suicide. And the paper's main idea or argument about that issue, that's missing. So they've got most of it, even though it's not executed well. It's executed average. Like, you're just meeting that base. Like, you've identified the community, you've identified an issue facing that community, but what is the actual argument? There's an attempt at an argument, but I would honestly say that they say that it's a large question. Why would anyone want to join a military branch when there's so much mental health problems? So the other thing that this introduction is missing is not only that data about suicide in the military, and then again, how that data is collected, and they would need to be specific about, are they talking about specifically people who are actively deployed, who are actively serving, or do these numbers also include veterans? Because there are people who are interested in mental health concerns of active service members, and then there are people who are interested in mental health concerns of veterans. Those are two different subjects of interest, of research interest. However, are you talking about both or one or the other or what? So that needs to be identified more specifically. And then also this larger idea of mental health. You know, people like to throw around that phrase mental health a lot. And they do in their final sentence say stress, suicide, and neglect. But I don't know how any of those are connected. If I am trying to infer how this functions as a thesis statement, I would say, okay, I understand the base idea, which is that because mental health concerns are not being adequately, competently, appropriately addressed in the armed services and potentially veterans, I don't know. Maybe it'll talk more about it in the body paragraphs. Because of that, maybe that's what they mean by neglect. That, people aren't going to want to join. There's going to be an increase that because of this increase that apparently there's an increase in suicides, even though no data is present in the intro to carve out or create that research space. That's how you would do that, is you would say, this is actually a problem because look at these numbers. It has steadily increased. This decade it was this decade it was that, this decade was that. Again, you still gotta question that data, where it's coming from, who's giving it, how it was collected, that type of thing. But, because apparently, presumably, suicides are increasing in the military, nobody's gonna want to join. So that's essentially an argument of there's a negative correlation, which means that one thing is going up and the other thing is going down. I ultimately think that that's not an argument. One, because there's no foundation for that argument. This is also what we call a disconnected thesis, because it's not connected to the rest of the paragraph. Because when we talk about introductions, we have the introduction and then we have the thesis statement. The thesis statement should be restating in one sentence, and sometimes a very long sentence, everything you've already presented in the introduction in all the yellow. It should not present any new information. It should not present anything that's like, hey, guess what? New information. That then is a disconnected thesis because it's not connected to anything you've already stated in the introduction. So here it's like, okay, well, now you're kind of saying something new. There is some very average C-level, organization to this, how they got from the very beginning to the end of this paragraph, but it's C-worthy. It's potentially less worthy than that. Maybe I was too generous, but I would say if I were talking to this student today and they handed me this and it wasn't a final paper, I would say, I honestly think there's a bigger question here. There's several larger questions. And it's not about the number of people who are joining the military. It's about what the policies are, how people are able to access mental health care. And it doesn't need to be made more accessible. And if so, how? So it's like there are much larger questions that are far more relevant to what you're talking about. But we don't have any information about that. And they're saying, again, I'll say mental health. Suicide on its own is not a mental health problem. There are going to be other factors that lead to someone deciding to take their own life. So what are the most, what does research or evidence say are the most prominent mental health concerns that lead to suicide? Because suicide on its own is not a mental health concern. Suicide is a public health crisis. It's a public epidemic, but it's not a mental health concern. There are other things that would then result in this. And so, is it depression? Is it PTSD? Is it suicide? Is it, you say stress. Stress is like, or this not you, the student says stress. Stress is such a broad thing. They can't, I would throw that out. Again, we would want some brief research here, evidence integrated into the introduction to say that, according to so and so, the main, mental health, I don't know what word to use here, but the primary factors that lead to active service members and or veterans, or active service members and veterans to commit suicide include whatever the research says. It's probably going to be a variety of things. And then ultimately, what this becomes a question about more largely is, well, how do we fix that? It's not fixable. How do we, what we call ameliorate it, make it better, mitigate it? How can we stop it from, what you say, increasing so drastically? How do we want to handle the situation? That would mean explicitly looking at the policies in place and looking at the psychiatric and the psychological access that active service members and or veterans have. I'm questioning, is this not doing the job? Where is the system failing this group of people? So that is which is thus leading to all of these suicides. The system is failing somewhere. Point it out. The larger question is not gonna, people don't want to join the military because of all the suicides. Like, no, there's bigger questions here that should be asked about the system, and genuinely having, how does the VA factor in? What are the federal, I can tell you that the federal budget decreased its funding this year for the VA. It also decreased the DoD funding, but it also decreased the VA funding by a whole lot more. So the actually looking at legislation, policy, access, and particularly with those in the military and those who have served in the military, active and or veterans, how they can, what they can access. And it's very bureaucratic. So that really needs to be fleshed out. Now, I said that this introduction needed a lot of things. It's very possible to include those things here and increase the length of the introduction not that significantly. And that's because a lot of what is already written is not effective. It's doing that bare minimum stuff, but it's ultimately, some brief integrations of evidence. I always tell people best practice is to integrate evidence into the introduction. But, this is largely, it feels like I'm reading a pretty bad blog, to be pretty blunt. I'm not impressed at all in any way. And I also feel like it's a disservice to service members and veterans, because I feel like you're thinking very small if you think that that's the large question. Don't do our service members and our veterans a disservice by not thinking that there are bigger questions to ask. I know this is going to be, it's going to be, my goal is to really kind of suss out the research essay. That's the introduction. One of the things in the previous, the classical argument, the previous version of the research essay, is there was a place in the rubric for forecasting. That's no longer there. I do want to make that point because that has to do with the introduction. Forecasting is everything I've already said, which is tell us what's happening. Don't wait until the body paragraphs. The body paragraphs are just taking what you've, the small bits of information that you've provided in the introduction and developing those more fully and supporting those ideas more concretely with more evidence. So the forecasting is, here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about this policy and the VA and blah, 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 and, you know, whatever, you know, would be relevant. I could say a lot of things, but it's honestly such a vague introduction that does such the bare minimum that it's difficult for me to say like exactly what they would include, because there's also not a thesis statement. When there's a thesis statement, it's a little bit easier because I can say, well, clearly this is what you're arguing. So in order to argue this, you need this, this, and this. I can give this, I would be able to give the student a wide swath of these, as you've heard me talk about already for quite a long time, of what might be needed in this introduction, depending on the argument, ultimately. But forecasting is still necessary. Even though forecasting isn't in the rubric, doesn't mean that we don't do forecasting. It's just that it's presumed that you should be doing forecasting. There also used to be a part for the thesis. I have a feeling they took out some of these rubric areas because they were too specific for an English 123 course. The thesis, like the thesis as a rubric area, because here I say there's an expository thesis, meaning that the thesis is not argumentative. And I say there's no controlling idea that is argumentative about the relationship between suicide and the military. That's just, I think I've said that. I think I've said that multiple times in different ways. I think they probably removed those two rubric areas because, like I said, it's an English 123 class, and those might be rubric areas that are more appropriate for like the 300 level literature courses I teach, for example, where I do absolutely have a thesis rubric area forecasting, you know, like that's all in there. Here, everything is within the introduction. The body, it says the body of the paper consists of multiple paragraphs that make a unique argument. We talked a little about that in class, about the issue being studied, drawing on multiple perspectives, i.e. your evidence, about the issue to do so. The body paragraphs are organized. This means you have good organizational structure to present the research analysis or argument in a logical manner. And ideas are strongly connected between and among paragraphs. Ideas are supported by high quality evidence from sources. Very standard explanation there. I could break that down. I could spend like 3 hours breaking that down, but I'm not going to. But if we look at, I want to kind of quickly just look at what they spent each body paragraph on. This first paragraph, the thing I look for in body paragraphs, first and foremost, are topic sentences. This isn't a topic sentence. The topic sentence is, this is what this paragraph is arguing. So this seems to focus on PTSD, right? Is there anything about PTSD in the topic sentence? Let's read it. To start, we need the background. No, get the first person out of there. Like the environment service members are in. Extremely stressful day-to-day lifestyles that rip you, second person, nope, away from everything, forcibly away from family, even if they live with you and potentially forward deployed. That I'm like, are you for or against the military? This feels more like a question of like what happens to soldiers, rather than I think I don't want to speak for people, for veterans or for active service members, but I would think that they understand that enlisting comes with the potential that you will be deployed and that you might be separated from your family. This feels, the language used here, it's not formal, it's emotionally charged. And because of those reasons, it's losing credibility. Not to mention it's not a topic sentence. So it doesn't talk, it's trying to focus on, well, sorry, this is the one sentence that opens up the paragraph. This is stressing me out. So this doesn't tell the reader what this paragraph about. If we kind of skim this paragraph, this stress while in these situations for months to years on end can and will have lasting impacts. Okay, give us some evidence. Those lasting impacts can always be found in the brain. Okay, we have a quotation here. That is an orphan quotation and probably a hit and run, my guess, because it has no signpost. Repeated exposure to varying mild stressors can eventually lead to the development of learned helplessness. Now, yes, there's a quotation there. There's integrated evidence, but let's think about the I'm laughing because I'm like, I said I was going to do this and now I'm doing something completely different, and I apologize for that. But very quickly, whenever evidence is integrated, there's a lot that I'm looking for. And I'm going to be looking particularly at the flow of information and the flow of how ideas are presented. So the sentence that comes before the quotation is, those lasting impacts can also be found in the brain. I don't know where else they would be found. Yes, they can have physical, if we're talking about if somebody lost a limb, or I don't know, we're talking about mental health. So why is the inclusion here of found in the brain? I don't understand. And then the quotation talks about this idea of learned helplessness. Repeated exposure to varying mild stressors. I will note that varying mild stressors is incredibly vague. Can eventually, that's an adverb that is vague, and it's like hedging, lead to the development of learned helplessness. It's not a very convincing quotation. Like, okay, repeated exposure to some form of varying mild stressors. Okay, well, waking up every day is a mild stressor for me. So are you telling me that me being stressed every time I wake up in the morning, I'm going to, maybe I will experience learned helplessness? So I'm sorry, I'm not trying to yell. I just, when I read this source. I have no idea why it's here. It doesn't say that this source comes from a conversation about the military. There's no signpost there, which means that there's no contextual lead-in written by the writer to say, and here's how this is connected. So there's no connection between these ideas and this idea of learned helplessness. The idea of learned helplessness is not in the topic sentence. So again, it's like, woo, new idea. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that. And the quotation on its own is not very strong. It doesn't really hold its own. It's not to say that this source is not good. It's more to say that this particular choosing of this quotation from the source may not have been the best choice. What about a definition of learned helplessness? Now they go on to talk about that, I think. Let's see. Let me also just go ahead and learned helplessness is a negative development. They're tossing around psychological jargon without explaining what it means. So that's a bad writing practice. Is a negative development, but not as bad as PTSD can potentially be for someone. There's that potentially again. That's hedging. It's still good, although there's other words we can use for hedging. So what I mentioned that this quotation here is an orphan quotation. I have a handout on orphan and hit and run quotations. This is also a hit and run. It's a hit and run when it's an orphan when it doesn't have a signpost. It's a hit and run when there's no evidence analysis. So anytime we integrate evidence, after that evidence, you have to analyze the evidence. What exactly the words from the quotation or even the paraphrase, whatever it is that you are putting in here, what does it mean? And how is it serving the topic sentence of the paragraph and the overall argument of the essay? That's not here. They just go on to learned helplessness is a negative development, but not one that's bad as PTSD. Tells me nothing. Then we have another orphan quotation. Stress I think they mean increases the likelihood of PTSD following new trauma exposure. Incredibly vague. This is another bad quotation choice from a different source because it doesn't mean anything on its own. So stress increases the likelihood of PTSD following new trauma exposure. I could probably say that and never study psychology in my life. It's like, yeah, okay, and tell me something I don't know. I think we can all presume that new trauma exposure is going to increase PTSD if you already have it, or if you are within the realm of likelihood of having that and being in a stressful environment that gives you new trauma exposures or offers regularly or on a semi-regular basis potential exposure to new trauma. It's a poor quotation choice. If first person we compound the fact that repeated exposure, there's no evidence analysis either, so this is also a hit and run. If we compound the fact that repeated exposure to overstimulating amounts of stress can lead to helplessness, I don't know what the difference is between helplessness and learned helplessness. So that's needed in this body paragraph. And increases are like, not our, I think you mean active service members and or veterans, likelihood of PTSD after any traumatic event. Anyone could understand how negative this will turn out. In the worst situations, being suicide, if not homicide. But we aren't talking about homicide. That's a very different conversation. Not all stress is bad. Yeah. Again, this is a common sense statement, but without proper care and policies to ensure that care is, again, you have given us no policies. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be so emotional. The student has provided no policies or legislation that they have taken issue with explicitly. Without proper care and policies, there are policies in place. What is wrong with them? Tell us what the problem is and how to fix it. Or what are your recommendations? Again, as I said before, where is the system falling short? Where are the policies and the legislation and the funding falling short? That's what needs to be addressed here. To ensure that care is granted, we should not expect our service members to feel heard or cared for. I don't know what that means. I mean, I could spend a lot of time inferring, but I'm not. No. C paper, C, letter C. Because there's some attempt to integrate sources, so bare minimum. Okay, you're integrating some evidence. It's not great. It's not really helpful. It doesn't mean anything, but it's bare minimum. Every paragraph has to have an argumentative purpose. When I used to meet with students face to face for conferences on papers, I would point to every single paragraph and I would say, tell me why this is here. Not because I didn't think it needed to be there or not. I wanted to hear why they put it there. And I would do the same thing always. I would do it with my students now if I could. Why is this what is the purpose of this paragraph? There's some interesting potential for this paragraph because we have ideas about the psychological concept of learned helplessness and PTSD. But the way it's talked about, the way the information is presented is ineffective. It is bare minimum, barely bare minimum. What I would have liked to have seen here is how the psychological concept of learned helplessness, which needs full-on DSM definition here, and PTSD, how the policies or legislation or whatever this person, care and policies is what they're taking issue with from the introduction. We're seeing it again here, but they're taking issue with something that they haven't really identified. They're just kind of screaming into the ether. Proper care and policies. Well, there is stuff there. I'm not making excuses for it. I'm just saying you do have to identify what is currently in place and where it is problematic. And so what is the relationship between learned helplessness, PTSD, how federal policies or federal funding or federal legislation that addresses PTSD and things like learned helplessness in active service members and or veterans, how is that connected to suicide or what is being done overall? So also there's no mention of suicide. I mean, the only thing they say about suicide is if we let this happen, they might kill themselves or other people. So I don't know what the purpose of this paragraph is, but it is introducing bare minimum some ideas that are interesting, that have room, that there could have been some really good work here by including this idea of learned helplessness, which is different from helplessness, but that's not defined here, and PTSD. but how that's connected to proper care and policies and suicide. I was going to suicide. I was like, no, suicide, or suicide rates. Because what hasn't been done here, for example, is provide evidence that there is a psychological or psychiatric connection between learned helplessness and suicide. I'm not going to pair. I'm seeing learned helplessness as one factor and PTSD as a second, or PTSS. So what is the relationship between like not only statistically but qualitatively between learned helplessness and to like how do we get from learned helplessness to suicide? You know, I think there's more research on PTSD or PTSS and suicide, but you're talking about both of those things. And what is the relationship between learned helplessness and PTSD? Because there is some connections there too. So, second paragraph, policies. I'm very excited. Let's look at that first sentence because it's a topic sentence, or it should be. Policies are a major step in, usually, the right direction. Except for what the DoD has done. Okay, I'm sorry. I don't mean to laugh. I don't mean to laugh. It also hurts to laugh. Okay, this sentence is this person feels very, there's a lot of emotional, I feel like there's a lot of anger and emotion coming in out of this paper, and there shouldn't be. When we write academically, we're oftentimes writing a little bit robotically because we want to present our arguments as objectively as possible. Because the more emotion we insert or allude to in our rhetoric, the more likely the reader is going to feel alienated or start making judgments about the writer and thinking like, you can't hold it together. Like you're too, you know, and therefore you're biased or you don't have ethos as a writer. So that's why but there's a way to say this without it coming off as the way that it's coming off. Because this is also a slightly better topic sentence because they've mentioned the DoD and policies. So I anticipate that this paragraph will be on those two things, which is desperately needed in this essay right now. And they're saying policies are usually a step in the right direction. I wouldn't say usually as the hedge word there. They can be at times, right? This is all hedging language. If I just said policies are a step in the right direction, I would be speaking as if it's a universal truth, which it's not. And this next, I included the whole thing because this is a fragment. It's a dependent clause. I will be doing a video on independent and dependent clauses. So it's not a full sentence. So they're saying like policies are usually a step in the right direction, but the DoD, they're just messing it all up. That's what I'm taking away from this topic sentence. And then we have a quotation. Again, it's an orphan quotation. Policy language barring service members with a mental health disorder from career opportunities could hedging create paths for discrimination. Something omitted. Most of the stigma reduction programs, I don't know what those are, currently implemented by the DoD target stigma in the public context. That needs a lot of evidence analysis because there's a lot of very specific things talked about in that quotation that need an explanation from the writer. So anytime I see what I think could be a long quotation as well, I will count the words, because in APA, this is 34 words. So it's a short quotation. So they don't need to do block formatting. Once the quotation is 40 words or more, then you're into a long quotation and you need to do block formatting. Before I say anything about that quotation, note how there's no transition between the yellow and the green. And then after the green, we have mental health. While it is a spectrum of treatment, is also a spectrum for prevention too, and should not be treated with only a large-scale effort. This effort potentially, they really like that word potentially, is not being done well. I like that they're getting a little bit more aggressive. It's not being done well. Okay, well, be more specific about what's not being done well. I like that you're now getting into criticizing something, because that's where we can find the argument, right? It's not being done well either if policies exist creating tensions between individuals. Again, we don't have an example of this. So I like that the writer is moving in this direction of, this isn't being done well. There's a problem here. So they're trying to say, like, there's a problem. It's creating tensions between people. There's this, there's that, but they're still not being specific about what policies. Also, it's a hit and run quotation because there's no evidence analysis. So what I would like to have seen after, or what I would expect to see after a quotation like this, especially a slightly longer quotation, is where it says policy language barring service members. I would ask specifically what policy language from what policy. And then it says policy language barring service members with a mental health disorder from career opportunities could create paths for discrimination. Well, yeah, if policy language, this is me trying this, because the evidence is not integrated well, I'm trying to make sense of the evidence, but I don't have the source in front of me. So because we don't have the sources in front of us, it's up to the writer to give that contextual lead in and explain, what's coming. And then after the quotation, explain what it means and then how it's doing work for the paragraph and the overall thesis or essay. So I need to know exactly what policy language we're talking about here, or at least Acosta et al. Is talking about. And then most of the stigma reduction programs, I don't know what stigma reduction programs are. I need a definition of, like, where is that? It obviously the DoD has stigma reduction programs. When they're talking about stigma, I don't know what type of stigma in these programs they're seeking to reduce, because I could think of a various number of stigmas that, when it comes to mental health disorders and active service members and or veterans, that there's stigma there. But what particular stigma are they addressing in these programs, the DoD? They say they target them in the public context. I don't know what that means. I know that stigma in the public context. Okay, what stigma? What public context? There's so a lot of evidence analysis is missing. So they go on to talk about these policies creating tensions between individuals. Which individuals? This tension and only top-down reactive responses. I don't know what that means. I can infer what it means, but that's, again, not my job. Can lead to more reactive responses and no initiative taking responses. This is a lot of responses in this sentence. Although the current process has not been the best, I don't know what the current process is because you haven't told us. Mental health is a process. Yes, it is. But mental health is also a very big concept, and you haven't whittled it down for the purposes of this particular research paper, very short research paper. Then we have another orphan quotation. Also, the punctuation for all of these are incorrect. They're not putting the period in the right place. It's a little frustrating. However, no signpost. The values of mental health promotion and illness prevention. I'm thinking to myself, what's the difference between mental health and illness? Like mental health promotion and illness prevention. Again, this is me trying to understand what the source is saying, because I'm sure they're saying something. Like the promotion of mental health care, mental health what? And illness prevention have been underappreciated more than those of physical health to date with regards to mental health. I don't understand that at all. There's so many broad statements in that quotation. And again, that's not to say that min et al, the cited authors, are doing something incorrect there. It's that this was cherry picked out of their source and put into this paragraph in a way that makes no sense. Mental health as a whole, a lot of people like to write papers on mental health, and it's like, why? It's such a huge topic. It's really hard to do. Mental health as a whole has not been treated the same as physical health. I have a lot of professional opinions on this, actually, based on my own research. So the fact that the DoD has any policies for this is a good step forward. What are their policies? I still don't know. But they need again, they're doing some good things and then some ineffective things. So the fact that the DoD has any policies is great, but they need reevaluation to determine actual effectiveness. Otherwise, the language barrier, career restraints, and reactive tensions are really necessary for the DoD to operate, or if more could be done in a proactive way. They're losing me at the end, in the latter half there. But again, we're seeing some like not complaint, but this is the argument. They're getting a little bit more specific now, because before it was just the policies, they're bad. Now it's the DoD's policies need reevaluated. But again, what are which DoD policy or policies? What do they say? And what about them needs reevaluated? And to what ends? They attempt to say what ends by saying, otherwise, these ends. But these ends are very confusing. What language barrier, career restraints? We've had no data about career restraints, language barriers, reactive tensions. I don't even know what reactive tensions means in this case because it's so ambiguous. But if you're going to talk about, which they brought up career and opportunities and discrimination earlier, we would need specific stats and data on career restraints, like how, if mental health, or because mental health policies, these specific ones, don't do X, Y, and Z, that it arguably delimits or problematizes the ability for service members or veterans again, I don't know who the audience is, to have a career have a post-military career. If that's what they're talking about, when they're talking about career, because you can have a military career, but you can have a post-military career. I don't know which one they're talking about. So, because in my head, I'm inferring, okay, so if they're trying to apply to jobs, firstly, there's a whole arc of if you're suffering with PTSD or PTSS and depression and suicidal ideation, then that in itself is going to make looking for work difficult. That being said, and maybe your interviewing skills would be more problematic, you would struggle with it maybe a little bit more. I'm hedging a lot here because I have no idea. I'm just trying to suggest this is what I think this student might be saying, but more so that an employer, because this gets into the idea of stigma, if an employer knows that you're a veteran, they might stereotype you and be like, oh, this person has PTSD, they're gonna commit suicide or homicide. I don't know, right? So we're going to discriminate against you because of these things that we think. I don't know. Again, I'm doing inference, so I could be completely wrong about what is attempting to be said here. And they talk about being proactive, but in a very, I can't address it. It's too vague, so I don't really have anything to say about it. Again, this is a C because they're bringing in additional ideas. They're talking, I don't even want to use the word specifically. They're talking more directly about policies and the DoD and bringing up this idea of stigma and, mental health stigma and how that could potentially impact career opportunities. And so again, there's there are ideas here, but it's very bottom shelf. So that's why we're at the C. And I'll repeat that they're using sources, they're using evidence, but the choice of evidence, not necessarily the choice of sources, the choice of evidence that they're pulling from the sources and putting in their paper, I would say that ineffective choices again of evidence, and the evidence integration is not there because we're missing signposts and we're missing evidence analysis. You're not integrating these voices with your voice. We're getting toward the end of the paper. This last short paragraph, if we look at the first sentence, because like I said, I always do that. Suicide has always been a major issue. Not always. Suicide in ancient Rome was considered a very noble thing to do. So this is where hedging is needed, and it's not being used because it's being purported as a universal truth, which is a logical fallacy. Suicide has always been a major issue, even if it is only one individual attempting suicide. However, not the correct grammar, but however, it has not been only one, nor are the attempts counted for a statistic. I don't know what that means. Okay, so this is okay, let's keep reading. Every quarter, the DoD releases a quarterly suicide report. Why is, okay, good to know. This should probably be in the introduction. Should probably be in the introduction. And we have another orphan quotation here. And this is where longitudinal data is needed. It's an orphan quotation, and even the suicide is not capitalized. So, okay. So the DoD releases the QSR for the whole year, which is weird because they call it the quarterly suicide report. So I would imagine it would come out 4 times a year, but I don't know. And the quotation chosen is suicide rate among military populations is comparable to broader civilian rates. This is same issue. It doesn't mean anything. The military should not even be comparable. That's that emotion coming through. I feel it in the rhetoric. Should not even. It's very aggressive. There's times when aggressive writing is beneficial, but we have to be very careful about I'm being aggressive to make an argument versus I'm being aggressive because I feel emotional. The armed services are comprised of volunteer service for the United States. It's not a volunteer service. People volunteer for the military, but they are compensated. So that wording, that syntax is a little problematic. For the United States, specifically, of a younger population between 18 to 20 years old. No, I would disagree with that. I don't understand that. How does that not sound horrific when put in this perspective? So the armed services, service members and or veterans, I'm just going to talk about service members now because I think that's who they're focusing on at this point. Service members volunteer, meaning it's not conscription as in other countries force people into doing so many years of service, right? The United States has, you can sign up for it, except in certain times when we've done conscription. So that's what they mean by volunteer service. But it's not voluntary, meaning you're not getting compensated, right? So there's some level of compensation at the end, but you do choose to go into that. The younger population, 18 to 20 years old, I don't understand why that's there, because I would say that the people in the armed, or the persons in the armed services, you can enlist. I think depending on what branch and what type of thing, not thing, but like job in the military, I mean, I think it can be up to like age 34 if I could be mistaken, but it's not just 18 to 20. That we're talking like recruiters might be aiming for, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds. Maybe they want to get them in earlier, or let them know that it's an option for them. So the age here, and then I also don't know, why are we mentioning age? Like, if you're going to mention age, how is that relevant? And that's not to mention the people who spend 20 years and they have military careers. So they have signed up, they've chosen this as a career, and it's a long-term endeavor. So no, they're not going to be 18 to 20. There are many people in the military who are of significantly older age than 20. So if I were to ask, the student, what's the purpose of this paragraph? I don't know. I don't even know that I can infer. I think the most useful thing that is in this paragraph is that there's a mention of the quarterly suicide report. There's no mention of how long it's been around. There's no longitudinal data present. There's just, it feels like a very emotional. The QSR says that suicide rates among the military populations is comparable to broader civilian rates of suicide, and that is wrong because the people volunteer to go in the military, and they shouldn't, leave it or stay in it. Again, I don't have the data to know specifically in what context we're talking about suicide, because of lack of care and lack of access, which they don't even talk about really at all. I'm inferring. Because they do this, they should, and it's younger people, I think the younger people might be more of this is all appeal to pathos, right? This is all very emotionally charged, which does not belong in an academic paper, because there are ways to say these types of things without it being appealing to ethos and logos and not pathos. Because I'm alienated. Not only do I not know what you're talking about, but I also feel that you're just talking from a place of emotion, and you're not providing me as a reader with actually proactive information that can give me a real slice of, this is what suicide looks like. What are the ages? They mention ages. What does the data say on ages for those in the military who have committed suicide? Does it tend to be younger people? I think that's part of why they bring in that age range, is to say not that it's mostly younger people committing suicide, but that these are young people going into them, again, they're coming from a place of emotion, at least according from a readerly perspective. They're young people who were targeted to, volunteer to be in the military, and then they're just gonna go get their heads messed up because of all the trauma and the stigma, and then have discrimination and potential career opportunities, and essentially their whole lives are going to be ruined, right? If I kept that line of logic, which fallacious logic, going. And it's not to say that it's incorrect logic, it's the way it's being presented is fallacious. You could very well draw an effective argument connecting one to the other to the other to the other, if the right data were present, the right research was present, and the way it was talked about, meaning not so emotionally, was present. And then the conclusion, again, coming from a place of emotion, while everything from this does paint a depressing picture, yet suicide is not. Yes, talking about suicide is depressing, no pun intended, but it has not gone unnoticed. We have another orphan quotation. The grammar problem here is that you don't put punctuation there. The punctuation always goes after the citation. Also, there's no commas in these in-text citations, and it's driving me insane. Austin has approved, Austin, Texas, Austin, a person, has approved the establishment of a resolute prevention workforce to strengthen DoD efforts to address suicide and other challenging areas. Okay. Yeah, that's great. I don't know really how it's connected. Changes are being made every year to challenge these situations and improve the entirety of the DoD. Clearly, this person has an issue with the niche here is the DoD. the DoD's approach to mental health. Because the DoD, you know, and it makes sense, but I'm so shocked that the VA is not mentioned at all. They're a very unique organization, but clearly the issue is with the DoD from the student's perspective. They're taking issue with DoD policies and how the DoD has approached or not approached or failed to competently recognize or take care of soldiers. And because of that, because of the DoD's lack of care in policy, that's leading to increase in suicide. I would probably say that is the trajectory of this student's paper. And there is something to be said there. That is a very important, critically important topic. Massively important. And absolutely DoD policies should be challenged, especially when we're talking about the mental health care and access to mental health care of service members and or veterans. Both, really. But the way, and hopefully I've shown this as I've gone through the paper in a very lengthy way, but sometimes it's a very tedious process because there's a lot more I could be doing. I could be actually rewriting this, revising it. I probably would only do that in an A or a B paper. It's very difficult for me to do that in a C, a D, or an F paper because it takes a long time for me to say, let me revise this sentence to model for you how it might look. It's more about, this was a C, this was bare minimum. They're just doing enough. It's also because I've done a lot of inference work. Now, there's times when I can't do any inference work because the work is so bad. That's when we start getting into the D and the F. You've left me so confused and without any information or organization that I can't even do inference. Should I be doing inference? No, not at all. Because we also never want our readers to say, I think what this person means in their argument is this. You don't want the reader to think for themselves, ever. You want to tell the reader exactly what to think. And you want them to be convinced by what you have to say. Writing can be very, very manipulative. But it's our job, and that's why we want to build bulletproof cases that don't get interjected by emotion, that are organizationally sound, and that are ultimately persuasive. Because if we have places where the reader can come in and say, well, I think what they mean is this, and then they misinterpret your argument, you haven't done your job. You've given the reader some space to come in. You didn't cover all your bases. And that's a problem. So, and they end it with, I think they're like, hey, yeah, everything's depressing, but there's, times are a-changing. Seems to be kind of the major theme here at the end. Changes are being made every year to challenge these situations and improve the entirety of the DoD. There's more. Changes, multiple, plural, are being made every year. Every year. That's a lot, especially for the DoD. The DoD, unless it's paying money out, which it has to report every single day publicly, changes are generally slow. So what are these yearly changes? And for how long have they been happening? there's a quotation right there that talks about something Austin, maybe Austin, Texas, maybe, I don't know, about this resolute prevention workforce, which to me sounds like a lot of buzzy business words. So I don't really know what that means. To strengthen the DoD, it sounds like there's a collaboration happening. Again, I'm doing inference. I shouldn't have to be, to address these specific. Okay, what is a resolute prevention workforce? What does this program look like? And what are the other changes? It's just this one? And also, for how many years has this been going on? Time and these efforts will hopefully change the chilly concerns, too emotional of a word and too informal, with stress, vague word, and its prevention of leaving lasting impacts, vague statement, ineffective policies, vague, reduce tensions, vague, and lower the number of suicides throughout the DoD. Well, we never got a number ever in this paper. There was never any data provided. There was never any policies mentioned. There was never any data of what the suicide numbers are. So at this point, it's like, I either can choose to believe you, or I could just go do the research myself. And that's also part of why we include evidence, is because if we're saying something like suicides increasing, also the DoD is, because because they want to avoid contradicting themselves, they can say the DoD has policies that ultimately fail soldiers when it comes to mental health, but they are working on making changes, and here are what some of those changes look like, and here's how that can ultimately, or it's projected to assist or ameliorate suicide numbers, or it's meant to provide better care or something along those lines. You can say both of those things. It's not this or that. But more information, but we have no data on what the suicide numbers looks like, who's committing suicide, why are they committing suicide, what are the various factors involved in that. And then again, that longitudinal data would be helpful. What is the last year, 10 years, 5, 20, 50 years look like? I don't know how long that data goes back for. And then last thing I'll mention about this is the references page. As a reminder, you need 5 quote unquote, high quality sources for this paper. This is not spaced uniformly. They have more than 5. I can't remember if it used to be 5 or more, but they have at least 5 here. They are in alphabetical order, which is good. And then I would look right away and see what is scholarly, that's what I would be looking at. Right away, I can see that some things are written in, a lot of these are online. This one is probably scholarly. This one is scholarly, that's missing information. It has a DOI. There are some things that are using title case that should be in sentence case. So that's generally what I'll be looking for on the references page, is making sure that there's 5 sources, that they are high quality. Are these all high quality? Would I argue that? I think for the most parts, yes. There's a combination of scholarly and substantive. There's also a book here. Right, because this is probably a scholarly source that is missing information. It's missing the volume and a potential issue, a page range. This is a book, right? It's noted as, it says handbook, and it's noted as ebook central. This is a news article, so that's a substantive web source. This is directly from the DoD. This is like I said, scholarly because it's from the NIH. This is, I would say, scholarly, but also missing information. So volume, potential issue, page numbers, and that type of thing. So hopefully, I know this has been very, very long-winded, but my goal was to go through an average research essay example and the and explain and I know what is a very tedious way. I could be more tedious. Why it's considered average. What is missing? What is needed, and which also lends to additional conversations about evidence integration and sources, which have been pertinent to some of the other work that you've been doing recently in the class. Going back to the rubric here, I want to make sure that, yeah, okay. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't a rubric section on a counter argument, and there's not. So I want to make sure that I'm not, I feel like I may have read that somewhere, but I want to make sure that I'm not missing it. Let me look at the rough draft explanation. Okay. So for the body paragraphs, right? Even though I said forecasting is not a rubric area, right? It's presumed that it's in your introduction. When it says, because when I brought up, because what that paper doesn't have either is an interaction or an engagement with the opposition or the counter argument. We've talked a little bit about that in class, which is a way to bolster our ethos as writers, because it demonstrates that we understand multiple perspectives on a particular topic. So in the body paragraphs, it's saying, right, provide a brief background on the issue or problem. Very brief, because most of this should be done in your introduction. Consider multiple perspectives or debates about this problem or issue. Note that this is not an order. These are just like things that should be present. Everything I talked about in the sample, that was much more of an order conversation. The argument, right, is part of the thesis statement that you continue to develop through the sub arguments or the various arguments in your body paragraphs. Okay. This is a potential mistake because it doesn't match the rubric. I'm going to, because of the annotated bib, I'm just going to make a, nope, this is the rough draft. Sorry. Because what I'm thinking of here is it says use 4 sources in your rough draft, but in the final version, you have to have 5 sources. So I was like, let me change this to 5 now, but I'm just going to leave it at 4. I feel like it should be 5 now because this is probably another question I'll ask to the course developers. Just to double check, like, do you want them to use 4 and then 5? Because that can get confusing, because then you can potentially forget to include a source in the final paper. But I would recommend keeping one brief paragraph before your conclusion. It's usually the best place to put it, in a paper of this length that briefly addresses the counter argument. And it's often a good idea to have one of your sources specifically speak to the opposition, not against it, that speaks in favor of it. And then you refute that. So because you're making an argument, it's also important to be able to say, hey, this is what this side says. Now let me, this is some evidence of what they're saying. Now let me explain how I'm going to bring you back around to my perspective and refute what they're saying, because they're not considering something, or they're not, or they've, blah, 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 something, right? There's something you don't agree with about the opposition, which is why we call it the opposition. So, I'll say more about peer review and stuff like that about the rough draft in the announcement, but this video has gone on for a very long time. So, but I did want to provide you a very, as a fairly comprehensive overview of the research essay, what one looks like. I chose that just straight 75, the average, so we could talk about why it's average, where it's confusing, where it's doing good things. But anyways, I'm going to stop sharing, and please let me know if you have any questions as you are working on your rough drafts, which are due, I believe, by the 4th day of this week. Because you also have to engage in peer review. So reach out and let me know if you have any questions in the meantime. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys soon.